Hi, everybody. This is the podcast, Everything About Hockey. Today's podcast, I'm doing a preview of the Eastern Conference teams for the 2023-24 NHL season. First, I'm going to start off with the Atlantic Division. Then I'm going to finish up with the Metropolitan Division. And the preview of each team will be going in alphabetical order according to their divisions. I also like to look at, stats-wise, I like to look at the goals for and goals against for the team. And for the individual players, I always like looking at points per game. First team I'm going to look at is the Boston Bruins. Let's see what they got as a strength. They had one heck of a first line last year. Marchment, Pasternak, and Bergevin were unbelievable. Marchment had points per game was 1.92. Pasta, he was over a point a game. He was 1.38. Unfortunately, Bergevin, he retired, which is a great loss for this team. And it looks like, and because of Bergevin's retirement, I think Pavel Zacha is probably going to be the center on this top line. Last year, his points per game was .70. He doesn't play like Bergevin. Bergevin was a unbelievably talented. I think he's more of a generational type of a player in a certain way. Not like most generational players like you would think of Sidney Crosby, Connor Bedard, Connor McDavid. You know, these guys that you think that are going to lead the league in scoring. He's more of a generational player in a Mark Messier, Steve Yzerman, Bergevin. These guys are just basically, they can play unbelievable defense. They can play really solid offense. They can give you clutch scoring. They can win face-offs. And they're just emotional and physical leaders. And that's what Bergevin was. So you're never going to be able to replace him. But they still have a solid forward that could replace Bergevin in that top 1C. I mean, don't get me wrong. He is going to be a downgrade from Bergevin. That's obvious. But they also have some other offensive capabilities, too. They have Jake DeBrusk. He was points per game was .78. He's a great all-around forward. But you also got to remember, this also has a tremendous defense. Charlie McAvoy is a unbelievable talent. I mean, I love watching him play every time. Then on top that off, they end up signing Shattenkirk to actually booster one of the top blue lines in the NHL that goes along with an elite high-end goaltending tandem on this team. So their defense and goaltending is not going to be a problem at all. Now, like I said, they lost a couple key retirees. Like I said before, they lost Bergevin, and they also lost David Krejci. He was one of those key parts, another one of those key parts that made this team really, really good last year. Losing them two guys is going to hurt. They also lost Taylor Hall, which I really don't think is going to be that big of a problem because they do have Fabian Lysell. They drafted him from the Vancouver Giants, 2021, first round, 21st overall. He's played for Providence Bruins, and he's put up pretty good numbers. It was 14 goals, 23 assists for 37 points. I think he's about ready to be a top six forward in the NHL now. He's really starting to develop quite nicely. And I think he can replace Taylor Hall. Now, the other two, I don't see them having anybody replace them. So I think their offense is going to go down a little bit, but they still have a tremendous defense and a unbelievable goaltending tandem to rely on to help them out. Face it, I mean, they got 65 wins, 135 points. Their goal for were 305, and their goals against was only 177. So, you know, this is a tremendously good team. You know, they should be a playoff team. Now let's look at the next team in the Atlantic Division, the Buffalo Sabres. Now, if you got to go with the strength with Buffalo, you got to go with that first line. Taves Thompson, Alex Tuck, and Jeff Skinner. They averaged over a point a game, all three of them last year. And now let's look at their 4-year average for those three guys. Tuck's 4-year average was .73. Skinner's 4-year average was .62. Also, Thompson's 4-year, actually it was a 3-year average because he was only at like 3 years, is .81. Now, I think that's probably the range. It's going to be close to a point a game from now. I don't really see Taves Thompson being a 50-goal guy on a regular basis. I think he's more in the 40 range, which is still pretty impressive, and he's still a legitimate number one center iceman. And they also have some really great secondary scoring on this team, too. Let's look at a couple of those guys. Yeah, obviously, the first guy you want to look at is Dylan Cousins, a guy that I've always was impressed with when they drafted him. And it's no surprise to me that he got 31 goals, 37 assists for 68 points, and his points per game last year was .84. He's a big, versatile center iceman. He fits right in with his team. He's an impressive guy, too. Nice secondary scoring he got there. And they also got a couple other guys that are kind of interesting, too. I've always had a really impressive thing with Victor Olofsson. I think he's a solid forward also on this team. And Middlestat is also an interesting thing. He was a high-end draft pick. It took him several years to actually figure out how to play in NHL. But now I think he's finally starting to figure it out, and he's starting to really produce. Now let's look at the defense. They've got a couple guys on this defense. They're becoming really good studs. They're high-end draft picks, both first overall on the first round of the draft class. The first one I'm going to focus on is, obviously I'm talking about Rasmus Dahlin. He's he can run the power play for you. He can push the puck up the ice and set tempo offensively for you. He's also a solid defensive defenseman. The only problem is his size. He can get pushed around a little bit in the defensive zone. He's not the biggest guy you're ever going to run into. But then on the other side, they also got a guy that's got a tremendous side. That was a first overall pick. Of course, I'm referring to Owen Powers. He's a 6'5", 220-pound defenseman. He's got great skating ability. He's got really good passing skills. The only problem is he's not a really solid defensive defenseman. He tends to get a little lost out there on the defensive zones, and he can kind of lose his coverage a little bit. He's got to learn that. And he's got to play with a lot more physical size. He's got to be able to push people around. That size, he's got to be a physical defenseman for him. So now let's just go with the weakness, since I've already started on that. The only really big shutdown defenseman is Matty Samuelsson. He's the only guy that they can really count on to be a real true shutdown defenseman. They acquired, and a veteran, very veteran, experienced defenseman, Eric Johnson. So, I mean, they got a little bit of physical presence there, but they still need a lot more than that. They can still get pushed around. And in the forward department, they really don't have any real true stud physical presence guy on there. You know, a guy that can really make room for the other team's high-end forwards, a intimidator type of a forward. That's their really true weakness. And the other problem you have to consider is their goaltending. You've got Eric Comrie coming over from Winnipeg. He's a little unproven when it comes to the starting job. And then you got Devin Levi. He's actually a proven NCAA Division I goaltender. He played really great for Northeastern last year in the Hockey East. But he's going to be a rookie this year. So we don't know exactly how well he's going to do this year. So they've got two goaltenders that's never been proven starters behind a defense that's not really that physical and not really great at shutting down the play. So it's going to be really interesting to see, especially with Devin Levi, see exactly how well he handles the intimidation that he's going to get in the NHL. I mean, college hockey there's some intimidation, but it's nothing like the NHL. The NHL, they're going to do whatever they want. And if a rookie goaltender, they're going to bump him They're going to slash him. They're going to do a lot of little tricks there to get him out of his game. So I think that's going to be that's going to be the weakness for the Sabres, is how they handle the physical play. And are they tough enough to withstand the physical play in the Atlantic Division? I mean, you're going up against teams like Tampa, Florida, Boston, and even Ottawa and Detroit. So you're going to need to actually protect that goaltender, because these teams I just mentioned, they still have some solid offensive capabilities that you're going to have to shut down. It's going to be really interesting to see what happens next year, or this upcoming season, with the Buffalo Sabres. Last year they got off to a tremendously hot start, and they kind of phased out a little bit towards the end. I'm really interested to see if they can actually do that again. Because if they start off slow, I don't know if they're going to be able to catch fire at the end of the season. But they still didn't make the playoffs. Remember, they got off to a tremendous start and still didn't make the playoffs. So let's look at the next team. Okay, the next team win is the Detroit Red Wings on the alphabetical order. Last year, their goals for was 2.89, and goals allowed was 3.35. Now let's see what kind of magic Stevie I has got for him this year. The new offensive additions for this team is JT Comfort. He comes from Colorado. And then the big fish, Alexander DeBrincat. He played for Chicago a couple years back, and last year he played for Ottawa. He's a true sniper and has a great shot. It'll be interesting to see what happens with him and Derek Larkin. I think that could be a really lethal, deadly tandem on that first line. And then they also have a couple other guys that aren't that bad either. They also got David Perron. He's a good utility forward. His points per game last year was 6.8. Then you got Lucas Raymond. His points per game is 6.1. So, I mean, they got some serious offensive capabilities. And they on the blue line's not that bad either. And, of course, I'm obviously talking about Mo Sider. He's a young stud defenseman they acquired through the draft. And the other young stud defenseman they got through the draft was Simon Edmondson. Right now he played for the Grand Rapids Griffiths in the AHL. But I can see him actually stepping up and getting some regular shifts in the NHL this year. So they got a really good base of offensive players. My big problem with Detroit, too, is toughness. They don't have a whole lot of toughness, especially in the middle six and on the blue line. I think they need to get a little bit more physical. And I'm also not that fond of their goaltending either. It's good, but it's not scary good. It's just above average. So I think that's going to be the big drawback for Detroit, is their physical play and the goaltending. If that can elevate itself, they should be a really competitive team. Okay, let's look at the next one, and that's the Florida Panthers. Now, that first line of Tkachuk, Barkov, and Carter Hagee is unbelievable. I mean, that's an elite line. Having Tkachuk, he just drives the play. He can do everything. He can crash the boards, pick up pucks behind the net. He can dig them out. He can make greasy goals. He can do a slap shot. He can do a wrist shot. He can do about anything. Great on the defensive zone. He makes that team. And then, of course, Barkov, he's great at controlling the tempo of the game. So, Florida has a really solid first line. I mean, they've got some tremendous offensive depth on that first line. Their goals for last year was 3.51. Not bad. Now, their goals allowed, though, was 3.32. So there was a little bit of a difference there. I like their defense, but I'm not overly impressed with their defensive core, especially their goaltending. I'm the exact same way about that. Borowski, he can be hot at times, he can be cold at times, Night, same way. He can be hot at times. He can be cold at times. I'm just not that thrilled. I mean, they both can be potentially elite goaltenders, but they just don't show it all the time. And same with the blue line. I mean, that could be a really great shutdown blue line, but they don't really show it all the time. They got hot in the playoffs, and that they made a great run to the Cup Finals. But look what they were doing in the regular season. They were fourth in the division. That's how, I mean, they barely made the playoffs. Boston, Toronto, and Tampa Bay were above them in the standings last year. So, I mean, they're not that dominant overall. They just got hot during the playoffs. And I kind of question, can they do that again? Or are they going to drop back down? Because that division has gotten tougher. With Buffalo and Detroit, that's a lot tougher division now. They did acquire some offensive depth this offseason. But is that going to be enough? That's a big question for this team. That's the weakness, I think, for this team. Is their new acquired depth going to keep them competitive in a very tough Atlantic division? Now let's look at the next team. The next team is going to be the Montreal Canadiens. I guess the first person I'm going to focus on, he was the first overall pick in the first round of the 2020 draft, Juraj Koskowski. He's a big, strong, powerful forward. He got hurt early on in the year, but I think that if he stays healthy, he can be a dominating factor on this Canadiens team. The other young guy is Cole Caulfield. I think this guy, even when they drafted him out of Wisconsin, I remember watching him play in the Big Ten in Wisconsin thinking, this is a pretty impressive, skilled forward. And he's still pretty impressive. Last year's points per game was .78. He was almost averaging a point a game. So, I mean, this guy's got some real talent. He's got great stick handling capabilities. He can shoot the puck. You go along with Kirby Dach and Nick Suzuki. I mean, they've got some pretty good forwards there they can count on. You know, I really think that, remember, their goals for last year was 2.70, and their goals against was 3.72. I think that goals for, if you get a healthy group of those four guys, I think that goals for could go up. But then again, on the weakness side is their defense. They really don't have a true number one stud defenseman. They really don't even have a really top pairing pair. A lot of them are just mid-level guys. So it kind of makes it a little tough to be a real threat in a very difficult Atlantic division. Remember, I just said the goals allowed was 3.72. That's not very good. And they definitely need to improve on that. And then, of course, their goaltending is not really that dominant either. So, you know, this team is going to have a hard time, I think, of keeping the puck out of the net. Now, the next one's going to be the Ottawa Senators. Now, I have to admit, I like the Ottawa Senators because of a couple guys on their team. First guy is Tim Stützle. Now, I really became a big fan of him. In 2021, he played on the under-20 team for the Germany national team, and I was really impressed with him then. I actually wanted one of my favorite teams to draft him. Ottawa got him instead. Yeah, he was actually really impressive. Actually, this year, he averaged over a point a game. Yeah, his actually points per game was 1.15. And, of course, you got to like Brandon Tkachuk. I mean, what not to like about this guy? You know, Keith Tkachuk's son, one of Keith Tkachuk's sons, he actually averaged over a point a game too. He actually averaged .100. So, you know, you got two guys that average over a point a game. Then you throw in a real veteran stud offensive scorer. Of course, I'm talking about Claude Giroux. He averaged almost a point a game last year. He averaged .96. So, you know, you got three guys that are really great offensively, right, on that team right there. Those three guys there. And their team goals for last year were 3.15. Of course, they also, the negative part, though, was they did lose DeBrincat to Detroit this year, which is to be a divisional rival, which could hurt their goals for a little bit. But they still got some serious scoring. So that is a strength, is their offensive scoring. Now, the weakness on this team that I've always felt was they still haven't got a big number one center iceman, a guy that can really drive the play, can really set the tempo. And their defense, it's good, but it's not great, and especially in front of these two goaltenders. Korpisalo, he's a solid starter when healthy. But remember, he's had back issues for the last 3 or 4 years. And Forsberg never really keeps himself consistent when he's playing. There's always a little bit of uncertainty what you're going to get out of him. You know, it's a tough one. But one thing interesting about this tandem now is they played for the Cleveland Monsters, and they won a Calder Cup together as the number one and number two goaltender a few years back when they were both property of the Columbus Blue Jackets. I thought that was kind of interesting that now they're back again together trying to do the same thing in NHL. But I do have my doubts with them. Like I said, there is some little problems with both players. Now let's look at the last two teams in the Atlantic Division. The first one is going to be the Tampa Bay Lightning. I mean, they still got their core. Stamkos, Kucherov, Point, Hedberg, the guys that actually got them multiple cups. I mean, that's a definite strength. If you ever would call something a strength. And of course, one of the elites, top of the game goaltenders right now playing, Valesky. He's still between the pipes there for Tampa. Face it, I mean, the goals for last year was 3.41. The goals against was 3.09. I mean, you can improve on the goals against. You're going to be at the top of the league. But even if they stay at that status quo, they're still a very high-end playoff team with that amount of talent they have, the guys I just named. The only weakness I can see is because of the salary cap, they've lost a lot of their bottom-end depth, you know, the bottom six forwards, bomb pairing defensemen. And they face it, these guys were, especially the forwards, the bottom six forwards, they were high-end. They were very good, very, very good, actually, bottom six forwards. They actually had to get rid of because of the salary cap's restraints. And I don't think it still hurts them. I think they're still good enough to be a solid team, losing that type of quality, lower depth. But they did in this offseason to get Calvin DeHaan. He's a quality veteran defenseman, a defensive defenseman, actually. He has had some history of some health problems. So that's a kind of a little bit of a concern for me there. But he is going to, if he stays healthy, he is going to keep that goals allowed, hopefully down below the 3.9 that they had last year. Now let's look at the last team in the Atlantic, which is the Toronto Maple Leafs. This has a great offense, this team does. I mean, their goals for this year was 3.39. You had Matthews, Marner, Nylander. Marner, his points per game was 1.24. Nylander's points per game was 1.06. And Matthews' points per game was 1.15. Then you add John Tavares' points per game is 1.00. You've got pretty interesting amount right there of offense. And then you add a very young, gifted Matthew Nyes, comes from the University of Minnesota, to add to that bunch. Then you throw on top of that a very hard to play against forward they picked up in the free agency, Tyler Bertuzzi. He got banged up a little bit last year, but he still can cause some havoc. This guy, if you follow my podcast for the last couple of years, you know I really wanted the Leafs to get some toughness. They finally got some tough. They got a big bruising bottom six forward, Ryan Reed. He's going to make room for all this offensive talent I just talked to you about. And he's going to make the defenseman a little hesitant of going after this high skill. Then you add on the blue line, Morgan Riley. And then they also acquired in the offseason a nice puck-moving defenseman, John Klingberg. He used to play for Dallas, and he played last year for Anaheim for a year. he's going to really help the offense. He can push, both those guys can push the puck really well. And both of them also can run a power play for you. So now they have two guys can run both power plays at the same level, which gives them great offensive capability from the blue line. Even though their goals allowed last year was 2.61, I'm still not thrilled with the goaltending the Leafs have. I'm kind of worried that this goaltending is going to fall apart again. Their starter, Samsonov, he has a pretty good year, but he still is really kind of inconsistent. You never know who's going to show up. The average guy or the guy that can keep you in a game. And that kind of worries me about that, having a starter, that's up and down. And their backup, well, it's Joseph Woe is the backup. Really, during the AHL time, when he played for the Toronto Marlies, I thought he was a solid potential number one goaltender. But now he just doesn't look as trustworthy either. He's had some flaws on his game too. So I worry about that goaltending. Which one of them can stand up and be a game-changing goaltender? That's a really true weakness this team has. And that's because of salary cap. They can't go out and get a stud goaltender because they don't have the money to do that. They're up against the cap on a regular basis because of the guys I just named off as their offensive threats. Well, that's how I see the Atlantic Division going. Now, we're going to go with part 2 of this NHL preview. Now we're going to look at the Metropolitan Division. First off, we're starting out with Carolina Hurricanes because we're doing this in alphabetical order for each division. So let's look at the strength and weaknesses of all these teams. You got forwards like Smechnikov, Aho. These guys don't put up great numbers, but they're consistently good at a 80 by 200-foot game. There is one guy that I really like in this offense. It's Teuvo Teravainen. He's a playmaking winger that really can drive the play. But really makes this team's strength is a defense. They've got 6 guys that play as a 6-guy unit, and they just cover everything. They're a smothering, high-tempo defensive core. Slavin is the heart and soul of this team, and this is why this team is such a good defensive team. He really controls everything. Then last year, they got Brent Burns. What can you say about him? He's just a big stud defenseman. Remember, Carolina's goal for last year was 2.56. Not that bad. Now this year they add Orlov, which is, he's a solid, talented, two-way defenseman, but he can play in the top 4 too. So, they've got tremendously deep defense. And then goaltending, they got 3 goaltenders that they can rely on. It's going to be really hard to score against this Carolina team. And all they need to do is have the offense chip in a critical goal at the critical time, and this team is going to be at the top of the standings. Then I also don't really talk too much about coaches, but Rob Brind'Amour has this team in such a Rob Brind'Amour style that it's amazing. As the fan of another team in the Met division, it's actually a little annoying watching how great this team can just swarm another team and just attack at all times, everywhere on the ice. It's Rob Brind'Amour's got this team playing like a championship team. Now let's go to the next team in the alphabetical order, and that's the Columbus Blue Jackets, which had a horrific injury-prone season last year. And really didn't represent, I don't feel, the quality that this team actually really had on the ice. But they did make a great advantage of that injury-prone season when they got that 3rd overall pick from the University of Michigan, Adam Fantilli. And also in the offseason, they got Provorov and Severson as the defensive help. And they still have Zach Werenski. And they got the newcomer coming up. He played unbelievable last year in the AHL. He was actually the first 18-year-old to actually get in an AHL All-Star game, voted into an AHL All-Star game, and that's David Juracek. So they got some really great, I shouldn't say great, they got some above average, decent defensive help coming up for this season. Because they had a really horrific goals against last year. It was actually 4.05. That was their goals against. They gave up 4 goals a game average last year. They have to get that down if they want to even be somewhat competitive in the Met. And the other strength is their young forward depth. Kirill Machenko, the young sniper. We have Corey Stillinger. He's a big power center iceman. And of course, Adam Fantilli. He comes from the University of Michigan. He was a Hobie Baker winner and one of the top scorers in the NCAA Division I ice hockey last year. Then you have Kent Johnson, starting to develop into a solid top 6 forward. Then they also already got Johnny Gaudreau, Johnny Blue Jacket, as he's better known, and Patrick Laine, old Patty. You know, they're starting to get some good offensive pieces there. The biggest weakness is going to be that their goals for is 2.63, and their goals allowed was 4.05. They have to improve that. If they plan on being somewhat competitive in the Met, they have to do that. And I think the thing I'm most concerned about is goaltending for this team. You know, Elvis, he's been inconsistent the last couple of years, and hopefully this year with a new goaltending coach, Manny Legacy has been released, and hopefully with a new goaltending coach, they can kind of get him back on track. And Tarasov, he's been hurt the last couple of years. Hopefully they can get him good condition and he can actually be a reliable backup. Of course, if that didn't happen, they could be picking pretty high in the draft again next year. Now let's look at the next team in the Met, and that's the Philadelphia Flyers, coached by Torts. I think this team is starting to develop into that rebuild mode. So this team doesn't really have a whole lot of NHL All-Stars on this team, but they do have a solid high-end goaltender, Carter Hart. That's a strength. He can steal a game for you. And they also got a forward that averaged last year over a point a game, Travis Konecny. They also will get 2 veterans back that were pretty banged up last year. Sean Couturier, he's a big center iceman, and Cam Atkinson, he's a nice top 6 winger for you. So they have that going for them now too. Their goal for was 2.67 last year, so it wasn't bad, but it wasn't outstanding. And then their goals for last year was 3.37. And it looks like Cam York will be anchoring a defensive core. Remember, they lost Provorov, though. That was a top 4 defenseman. But they did pick up Sean Walker. He used to play for the Kings. He's a good depth defenseman. You know, he can play an all-around game for you. And remember, they still have Corey Hart, which I think is a high-end goaltender. That's the strength on this team. And then, of course, the weakness is obvious. Overall team depth at the NHL level, an elite scoring forwards, and number 1 defenseman. They don't have a true number 1 defenseman that can drive the play, run the power play. They also don't have a true sniper at the wing that can scare another team. Just overall team depth. But like I said, they're trying to do not a rebuild. They're trying to do a retool, a quick retool, and that's why the team is like this right now. So I can see this team having a hard time fighting for a playoff spot. Now let's look at the next one, which would be the New Jersey Devils. Now they've got quite an offense, and that's going to be their strength. First, look off at their big number 1 center iceman, Jack Hughes. His points per game was 1.72. And then they also got a pretty good set of wingers. Jesper Bratt, his points per game was 1.89. And they also added great scoring depth at the trade deadline with Timo Myers. Then you add on Nico Hischier. His points per game was .99. And then Mercer, his points per game was .68. So they've got some serious offense. And last year's goals for was 3.52. And I can expect that to go up with the amount of offense they've got. And then on the defensive side, they still got Dougie Hamilton, and they also got newcomer Luke Hughes, who comes from the University of Michigan, and he was a really good offensive defenseman at the University of Michigan. He really drove the play from the back end for the Wolverines last year. So scoring goals for the Devils should not be a problem this year. Now, defensively, that could be their weakness. Okay, this is something I just don't understand. 2 years ago, the Devils did not make the playoffs, and their goals allowed was 3.68, and they didn't qualify the playoffs that year. So what they do, they end up acquiring a couple guys, 2 defensemen and a goaltender to help them out. They picked up John Marino. He played for Pittsburgh before this. Brandon Smith, and then they also got the goaltender that was playing for Washington at the time, Vanacek, to help him out, see if they could get some defensive help. And it worked. Their goals allowed were now, this last year, 2.17. Remember, 2 years ago, their goals allowed was 3.65. So it dropped almost a goal a game. Actually, it was a plus .97 when they added those 2 defensemen and the goaltender. What they do this year, they need to add a little bit more money up front to get some of their star players back in the lineup. They decided to release Severson and Graves, which are top 4 pairing defensemen. And they also decided to get rid of Blackwood, which he's a backup goaltender. He's a little inconsistent, but at least he's a depth guy. And go ahead and get 2 really kind of inexperienced goaltenders as their top 2 goaltenders, which kind of makes them in a situation where as a playoff contending team, and actually what they consider a cup contending team, they do have one of the worst goaltending tandems in that category. Even though Vanacek played good in the regular season, he was basically nothing during the playoff situation. And then to top it off, to replace the 2 defensemen they lost, the top pairing defensemen, top 4 defensemen they lost, they're going to use 2 rookies to try to fill that void. Now, Simon Nemeth, he was a second overall pick a couple of years ago. He's a solid defenseman. He played pretty good at AAA. But I don't know if he's ready to be a top 4 guy. And Luke Hughes is the other one. Played for University of Michigan. He's more of an offensive-minded defenseman. And he's going to get a lot of time in the power play. But I don't know if he's also ready to play top 4 minutes in the NHL. That's my big question mark is, are those 2 guys ready to play? And is Vanacek ready to be a true number 1 goaltender in the NHL and be able to not only play good in the regular season, but also be able to play good in the playoffs? That's my weakness for the New Jersey Devils. Now let's go with the New York Rangers. Now this team should be in the conference finals the last couple of years. This team is unbelievably talented up front. They have elite talent up front. Okay, now we're going to start off with the guy that I think runs this offense, the Vanacek. He's an unbelievable passer. He can shoot. He's got good defensive skills. He's an all-around number 1 forward. Number one center iceman, a 1C. He's a high-end 1C is what he actually is. Then you also got Panaris. This guy is a scoring machine from the left side. He can drive the play from the left side. It's amazing what this guy can do. He averaged over a point a game this year. His points per game was 1.12. which is normal. Breadman production. I mean, what else do you expect from the Breadman? Score goals. Then they also got Chris Kreider. He averaged his points per game were .81, if I recall right. And he's definitely a high-end, all-around forward that can high-end forward that can score, can pass, can play in the power play. Then they also this year they just acquired Blake Wheeler from the Winnipeg Jets to add a lot more offense to this team. Then you add on the blue line Adam Fox, which is his points per game was .99, just under a point a game. This guy is definitely number one defenseman on any team. He can run the power play. He can penalty kill. He can play in all situations. He's definitely a 200-foot by 80-foot defenseman, an elite defenseman they got there. They add on to this. And then you also put on their goaltending situation. Of course, I'm talking about Igor Shesterkin. I mean, this guy is an unbelievable goaltender. I don't understand. I think this guy can win multi-Vezina trophies. He reminds me a lot of Borowski when he was playing for Columbus for those few years. A guy could just dominate a game. He can take over. He can win a game by himself, Shesterkin. I mean, seriously. He don't need the defense. He don't need the forwards. You just put him out there, and he can just stop everything. He's an incredible goaltender they got. And they're solid on the goals for and goals against. Goals for last year was 3.33. Goals against was 2.63. So they got a solid defense and a nice group of offense. Now let's get into the weakness. The weakness is how old this team is. And their young guys, like Cabo Caco, he was actually a second overall pick a few years ago. He's not quite developed into what they thought they were going to get. Then you also have to look at their first overall pick in 2020, Alexei Lafreniere. Now he should be a top 6 center iceman for the NHL, but he's never quite developed into this thing, and he's a little inconsistent. And the big problem right now is he's a restricted free agent, and they only got a couple $1 million in cap space. So I'm wondering even if he's actually going to even be on the team in the next year or so, because they need the cap space and he's not producing. But that's my example of they drafted high players and their high young players aren't producing. So then that's why they have to go out and get a Blake Wheeler to actually help them out with the offense, which is a 36-year-old forward they signed for $1 million this year just to give him a little bit of offensive boost, because these young guys just aren't producing. The other concern I have is if Shesterkin ever did get hurt, they got Jonathan Quick as the backup. He was great when he was in his prime, but he's no longer really should be considered a true number one backup. He's old and he's unreliable. Now he can make a few adjustments to help himself out a little bit, but he's been in the league for 16 years. This is going to be his 17th season playing goal in the NHL. He's old, and his body's starting to wear out. The next team I'm going to look at is the New York Islanders. This team's always got great depth, but they added a really interesting piece this offseason, Bo Horvath. He's a true top 6 two-way center iceman that plays an 80 by 200-foot game. His goals last year was 31, his assists were 23, and his points was 54, and his points per game was 1.10. So he was over a point a game. He plays the Islander type of game, and I think he'll fit in really nicely with Matt Barzal and Kyle Palmieri. Also, their big power forward, Andrew Lee. Now, what makes it interesting is those three guys have a hard time getting over a point a game in a season. So having a guy that can get over a point a game, it's really going to help their offense. I think the guy that's most interesting that I like to see, I think will benefit the most from this, is Brock Nelson. I think this guy is better suited for the bottom six center ice position. The third line, really, I think that would be the ideal spot for this guy. And the Islanders already got a really great overall depth at forward and defense. So I think this is really going to help them kind of spread out everybody and kind of put people right in the right positions, in the right slot, the best suits their skill set. And also the other strength is goaltending. Starting goaltending, Suzerkin is definitely a quality number one goaltender. Now, the weakness, I think, for the Islanders, like I said, they don't have an elite number one sniper on the forward. They can guarantee them they get that clutch goal. And they also don't have a true number one defenseman, a top pairing number one defenseman that can play power play, penalty minutes, log in 30 minutes, and just dominate from the blue line and really push that puck. This is, I think, also that's going to be a problem. They should do pretty good in the play or regular season, but when it gets to the playoffs, you really do need those two positions taken care of. Okay, this thing was supposed to be in alphabetical order, but I just realized going through my notes just now that I put Philadelphia ahead of the New Jersey Devils, the New York Islanders, and the New York Rangers, when technically they should be back here with Philadelphia, my next team I'm going to preview. That's what happens when you just start writing notes down and you don't really look at the actual teams you're dealing with. So I do know that P does come after N in the alphabet. Okay? Now let's look at Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh, strength is going to be their offense. Last year's their goals for was 3.18. Their goals allowed was 3.21. And they still have Crosby. They still have Malkin. And face it, you don't need elite wingers when you have these two guys driving the offense. Just above average scoring wingers can get the job done in this situation. Now I'm not going to say that Jake Getzel is just an average winger. He's a solid, high-end winger. And I'm also not going to say that Brian Rust is just an average winger. He's a solid, high-end winger too. They got some really good high-end wingers. But I'm just saying that with Malkin and Crosby, they can produce goals with just average guys. So you know this team's going to have some really good offense with those two guys down the middle. And Jeff Carter is a solid replacement. If one of those two guys get banged up a little bit and have a short-term out for a little bit of time, you can put him in their top six center ice position, and he can do the job for short term. So they get some depth down the middle, and having depth down the middle really can help your offense. But the big thing was the trade with San Jose just a little bit earlier. They acquired Erik Karlsson. You get him in a Pittsburgh sweater, he's going to make all the difference. He can run a power play. He can be a guy that's well over a point a game for a regular season. He can drive the play from the back end, and he can get the puck to Crosby and Malkin real easy. So this offense is still going to be good with this defensive core that they got. Now, the defensive side, I'm a little worried about. They're not overly physical, and also another big weakness is the age of this team. This is an old team, which means that they're injury prone because of their age, and they can get worn out real easy because of their age. And also goaltending. I'm not really overly thrilled with the goaltending tandem either. I think they're both real inconsistent goaltenders. So they're going to try to basically outscore the other team. Is what their concept is. Okay, now let's talk about the Washington Capitals. Now this team is basically all they're focusing on is Alexander Ovechkin, Ovi, beating Gretzky's total goals record, which stands at 894. Ovi's got 822 right now. He needs 72 goals to tie him 73 to beat him. He's still got 3 more years on a contract. That means then he has to average 24 goals a year for the next 3 years of time. And the last year, he has to get 25 goals, which should be something he easily should be able to do. Then if he accomplishes that, he will become the all-time NHL goal scorer. Right now, his age is 37 years old. That means he will be 40 years old when he breaks this. And now remember, Gordie Howe played hockey until his 50s. So, I mean, he could play until his 50s, but he could easily do this. And him getting 24 goals a season shouldn't be that big of a deal. The only thing that it could occur is the age of the overall team. For example, Kuznetsov, probably his center, he's right now going to be 31 this year. TJ Oshie, he's 36. His longtime center iceman, Nicholas Backstrom, he's 35. And to help out with the offense, they acquired Max Pacioretty. He's 34 years old. The only young guy that they acquired was Daryl Strone. He came from the Hawks. He's a good possible center iceman for Ovi, but he's 26 years old, but he is known as being a little inconsistent. He's talented, but inconsistent. So this is kind of a mixed bag when it comes to strength, weakness. Now, I think that it's going to be a strength because they're going to do everything they possibly can to get Ovi the puck so he can break Gretzky's goal scoring record. But for a weakness, though, is they got a very old team, and they should be starting to go into a phase of a rebuild or at least a retool. But because of the team they've got and the situation they got with Ovi, they're kind of not really going into a retool mode. They still want to go all out, a possible playoff team, and see if they can actually get Ovi that record. I guess you can really look at this whole entire situation by looking at their goals for and goals against. Washington's goals for last year was 3.9. Washington's goals against was 3.18. But they still wanted to keep themselves as a possible playoff team. And they still have the illusion that they can still make a solid run with these guys. Now, the goaltending I like. Darcy Kemper is a solid goaltender. Defense, I'm a little questioning overall. They still could have used in the free agency another top 4 defenseman. And I also really question the depth in the bottom 6. I think that's a little suspect too. Overall, I mean, I still think this team, I know what they're trying to accomplish, but you really should have considered going into a rebuild mode right now before it's way too late, because down the road, this is going to be a really hard rebuild. And don't get me wrong here. They got some really good prospects, a couple really good guys that I think get potential to be high-end top-line wingers for this team. First off, Ivan Breshchenko, they drafted him to replace Ovi, and by looks of his reports of stats and highlights, it could really be a possible Ovi replacement. In this year's draft, Reiner Leonard from the U.S. Under-18 national program has a real potential to be a top-line winger too. So they got some guys that can do it. It's just a matter of they need to stock up that pipeline before it's all these other guys just retire on them all at once. Because it's a proven fact, the way you rebuild in the NHL is getting one of those top 5 draft picks on a couple years in a row. Then you have a real good chance of jumping right back into the playoffs. But just missing the playoffs isn't going to get you that quality of an NHL player. Okay, this is my evaluation of the Metropolitan Division in the NHL for this year. Thanks for listening.